I honestly don't know how I've been doing terrain videos on YouTube for 5 years and never done one on lava terrain. Hey guys, welcome back to Blackmagic Craft, lava terrain. It is such a classic theme for terrain. It's so impactful on the table, and it works great in both war games and RPGs. Like, you can make a big board of hellish lava terrain and it will be equally useful for something like Warhammer 40K or Age of Sigmar as it will be for something like Dungeons and Dragons. The sponsor for this week's video is Crippled God Foundry, and they just launched a really cool Kickstarter called Shattered Hell that is packed full of demonic miniatures for tabletop games. Like this dude. I painted up one of the demons previously, and he now commands a legion of Nurgle demons in my 40k army. But this time around, I was inspired by this big hellish bad boy right here. This is a really cool model, and I really wanted to paint him because I've never done a big flaming demon model before. Sure, some flame elements on minis, but not something like this, and I was pretty proud of my paint job on him. I'd like to at some point build a big battle board in this kind of hellish lava theme, but I've never made any before or painted lava tiles before, so I thought it would be prudent to make a couple test tiles. Now, if you are a game master and you run a lot of RPGs, tiles might be exactly what you need or want, so these will be good as is. They're easy to transport, they're easy to store, they're modular. But if you want to do a big battle area, well, the principles are going to be the same. You just build it on a big area instead of a small area. I painted one with cheap acrylic craft paint and a brush, and the other I used model paint and an airbrush. Can you tell which one is which? I did this both for myself to learn what worked best when I eventually move into a bigger project, but also to prove that, you don't have to be limited by the tools that you have available. I started with 6" by 6" squares of 1/2" insulation foam. If you're struggling cutting perfect squares of the foam, I have an old video focused just on that you should check out. It's gonna help you out. Now, this substrate could be anything, but foam is really quick and easy to cut. For the cracked earth, I opted to use cork. This stuff is pretty easy to find and generally pretty cheap. I grabbed these packs at Dollarama for only a couple bucks. The nice thing about cork is that you can just rip it and get really great looking edges, and it has a really nice natural texture built right in that will work really well for painting. But it's also completely flat, which makes it really good for playing with miniatures. Sure, you could use something else or enhance the texture with sand and glue, but then you'll always face that issue of an uneven playing surface. In my first prototype tile, I used hot glue to attach random pieces of broken cork to the foam, creating crags which would later become streams of magma. The most efficient way to do this is to just run the pieces wild, go over the edges as you can easily cut them flush afterwards. If you're doing tiles, I wouldn't worry too much about making these crevices line up. Sure, it looks good in theory when they do, but it also looks fine when they don't. And personally, I think that if you make them always line up from the exact same point on every side, it creates patterns that look way too uniform and unnatural. So just don't bother. For the lava itself, you're going to want some texture, and acrylic latex caulking is a great candidate for this as it's really cheap, accepts paint really well, and is pretty easy to work with. I diluted a bit with water and worked it into the cracks. This proved quite difficult to get into certain areas, and nearly impossible to not get all over the surface of the cork. While trying to blend out the mess that I made on the edges, I figured I might as well try coating the entire surface of the cork just to see how the caulking in combination with the cork worked for a finished surface. I applied it as thinly as possible in order to preserve the natural texture of the cork. At this point, I had an epiphany. Why hot glue the cork to the tiles and then awkwardly try to fill it in with the caulking? Why not kill two birds with one stone? Why not just use the caulking as the adhesive? So I grabbed a scrap piece of foam to test this idea. I covered the whole surface in undiluted caulking and used a brush to stipple on some quick texture. Then I just pushed the pieces of cork in where I wanted them. This was so much easier, faster, and way better looking. It allowed for far more texture in the lava areas and required very minimal cleanup with a brush. Since I had that extra test piece, I broke out my Mod Podge and black paint mixture and gave the cork a coating in that. This way I could compare which worked better for the surface, the Mod Podge or the caulking. With this new, much better method, I created 2 new tiles on which to test the 2 painting styles. Once dry, I found that the Mod Podge made the cork significantly harder than the caulking, and it retained more of the natural texture. It was the clear and undisputed winner. But before we jump into painting the tiles, I want to take a second to tell you about the sponsor of this video. Crippled God Foundry has just unleashed Shattered Hell on Kickstarter. This entire campaign is dedicated to really cool miniatures with a hellish origin and theme. The focus is on the demonic, with over 50 original sculpts to summon to your gaming table, inspired by Greek lore, Dungeons and Dragons, video games, and film. Of course, there will be some brave heroes as well. What makes this project special is the offering of both physical resin miniatures and STL files for at-home printing. Whatever way you like to build your collection, there will be an option for you. These models are of course great for tabletop RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons, but many of the models make excellent proxies for various war games. The physical minis are hand cast in resin, and from my experience working with many of their models over the years, these casts are clean and detailed, they require very little cleanup and only have the faintest of mold lines and never seem to have any flash to deal with. And the resin they use is really flexible and durable, so you don't really need to worry about the models dropping and breaking like you might with some other more brittle varieties of resin. If you want to get these minis, the Kickstarter will be the best place to do so, as the prices will be heavily discounted, up to 40% off the future retail pricing. They'll also ship internationally, and they have successfully filled previous Kickstarters. I really love the work Crippled God does, and every time I work with one of their models, it's an absolute pleasure. So be sure to check out the campaign. There will be a link in the video description you can use. Thank you so much, Crippled God, for sponsoring and inspiring this video. Now for the painting. This is where the experiment really gets interesting. I've never painted lava terrain before. This was my first time. And on a quick browse of YouTube, it seems like there's hundreds of videos about painting lava terrain, each with their own unique approach. Since there were so many options, I decided to ignore all of them and just wing it. I wanted the stone to be really dark, so I gave everything a coating in flat black craft paint. Then I moved directly into an off-white, no grays or anything, just an ivory or kind of creamish color dry brushed over the entire tile. Essentially, I'm mimicking the way I often paint basic mini bases. Then a wash. On mini bases, I do the same simple cream dry brush over black, followed by a wash in Airbrush Earthshade. But of course, I'm not going to be using expensive Citadel wash on big terrain, so instead I just use a homemade brown wash. I've also got a video showing you how to make this wash and its recipe and all that. You can check that out if you need. I really love the way this simple 3-stage paint looks, and I think it's perfect for hellish tiles. The little bit of red in the brown wash lends itself well to a fiery hellscape. For the lava, 3 cheap as you're gonna get craft paints. With the red, I selected one that was a little more on the orange end of red instead of like a blood red. I watered this down significantly and brushed it over the lava areas. The thin paint helps avoid making too much of a mess on the surface of the tiles, as you can go in with a damp paper towel and dab off the excess mess. This will just leave a thin tint that almost mimics the overspray of an airbrush. It took a second coating before I could move on to the orange. And this was applied in the same way, with multiple thin coats. The hardest part is getting all the texture of the cork edges sufficiently covered without getting too much on the surface of the tiles. And it probably took about 4 coats before I got the orange opaque enough to move on to the yellow. The yellow was simply a repeat of the last steps, but this time I focused more on the center of the lava to try and make it blend from yellow to orange to reddish orange, with the brightest, most yellow areas being in the center. This worked really well, but took many coats to get good coverage. Seriously, it was slow. To help sell the idea of glowing hot lava, I highlighted the hardest edges of the cork with orange and followed that by a very minimal highlighting of the sharpest edges with yellow. I finished off the tile with a second coat of brown wash to kind of slightly filter some of the reds and oranges that kind of got too much onto the surface of the tile. I must admit, this came out a lot better than I expected, considering it was my first time painting lava, and it was done with the cheapest craft paint you can buy with only a paintbrush. For airbrushing, the stone was painted in the same way, and 3 similar Vallejo game colors were selected. All of the paints were thinned about 50% with airbrush thinner and had a drop of flow improver added. Starting with the red, I realized that the orange red I selected was far more on the orange spectrum once applied than I anticipated. Rather than switching to get a different red, I proceeded so that I could see if that affected the outcome much versus the hand-painted tile that had a far truer red applied as the first coat. The difference between applying the coats with an airbrush versus a paintbrush is staggering. It took far fewer coats to get good coverage, the coats were faster to apply, and there was no waiting around for previous coats to dry before moving on. I cannot stress how big of a difference there was with efficiency here. I could keep working continuously from one coat to the next because the thin coats of airbrush paint dried so much faster. I did have to be mindful of overspray, but a little bit on the edges looked good for a glowing effect anyway, and overall it was easier to be tidy with the airbrush than it was with the paintbrush. I would estimate that I applied all the coats of colors with the airbrush in the same amount of time it took me to apply the probably first 2 coats of red by hand. To finish it off, I did move back to the paintbrush to do the same edge highlights I did with the first one, as well as the same second wash. I've made it very clear that the airbrush was far more efficient, but are the results better? Honestly, I'm not sure. Both look pretty similar. Even side by side, while not identical, they are not drastically different. I might even argue that at a distance, the hand-painted ones look better and have a better glowing effect. Actually, that's not a maybe. I really like the hand-painted ones more. Up close, they have their shortcomings, but viewed from a normal gaming distance, they straight up look better. They look hotter, more believable. Now, some of this I think is due to the fact that my base coat was a truer red on this one, which I think looks better on the edges of the cork and creates a more realistic molten look. So if I end up doing a much bigger board in this theme, I'm gonna have a pretty difficult time deciding which method I'm gonna use. You know, the airbrush is far more practical and faster, so I probably will go that route, but I'll definitely be mindful of the red that I choose. I think this really proves that you can do similar paint jobs on this with a paintbrush or an airbrush, so don't be limited by the fact that you maybe don't have an airbrush. Thinking about that, if I do a huge board, I'm gonna have a difficult time airbrushing it because it won't fit in my spray booth, and that means I gotta spray outside, and here we're moving into winter and outside painting season is about to be over like today. I'm curious to know which one you guys think looks better, or if you think there even is a big difference. Like, what do you think? Let me know in the comments section below. I hope that you found this video helpful. If you did, hit the like button and maybe share it with a friend who might also find it helpful or in your favorite hobby group. Of course, if you want to get in on these really sweet miniatures, check out the Kickstarter Shattered Hell. Link again is in the video description. If you want to pick up some tools or supplies for your own crafting needs, maybe you do want to grab an airbrush, check out my essential equipment page on blackmagiccraft.ca. There I explain and link to all of the stuff that I use regularly, and shopping via that page helps fund the production of videos like this. And if you get a lot of value out of these videos that I make each and every week, and you really want to help me keep making them, the best way you can support the channel is through Patreon. That support really goes a long way. Thank you to all of my past and current Patreon supporters, and to you who may be considering it, I'd love to have you as the newest member of the Black Magic Craft Fellowship. That's it for this week, guys. I'm pretty happy about this experiment. Cheers.